And is my clock ready? Yep. Okay. Then 6 minutes starting. I affirm that the justices of the Supreme Court ought to be term limited. Because the resolution regards law and the structuring of government, I value governmental legitimacy defined as the valid authority over citizens. Professor S. Fairmont in 06 elaborates. Legitimacy is most often evaluated by the origins of government's power. Almost all states subscribe to the notion that the will of the people constitutes the ultimate source of governmental legitimacy. A government is legitimate if it could be said to be a government by the people. Thus, my criterion is respecting the origins of power. To clarify, this is concerned with a procedural respect for public representation and accountability. Prefer the standard for 2 additional reasons. First, a government's power doesn't come from a piece of paper called a constitution. It comes from the people who consent to that constitution as a social contract. As with any contract, they cannot legitimately consent if they don't have an equal say in the meaning and terms of agreement. Second, no public official has an absolute claim to authority. They are always dependent on the views and values of the public. As argued by philosopher Spinoza in 1677, since the Commonwealth is determined by the collective power of the people, the greater the number who are given cause against it, the more authority is diminished. Accordingly, I offer 3 contentions. My first contention is giving power to the people. By virtually every measure, the current system of lifetime tenure for Supreme Court justices has no legitimate claim to be by the people. First, the only say citizens have over the court is through the president they elect, but how many justices the president appoints is practically random. The 46% of Americans that voted for Trump got 3 Supreme Court justices, while the 50% that voted for Carter in 1976 got 0. As Lindgren in 06 explains that vacancies tend to be packed together, such that years will pass and suddenly 3 or 4 seats open up. Second, there's no realistic way for the public to hold justices accountable. No matter how bad they are, the only check, impeachment, is politically impossible. As Lindgren explains that a successful nominee has the potential to remain on the court for such a long time, there is simply too much at stake for a party to lose a justice. As a result, half the Senate will never vote to convict a justice appointed by their party. Third, a supermajority of Americans are opposed to lifelong tenure. Bresco in 22 reports that 2 in 3 Americans favor term limits, including a majority of both Democrats and Republicans. Adams in 21 furthers that when the National Constitution Center organized separate groups of progressive and conservative scholars to draft proposals for improving the Constitution, both concluded the Supreme Court should be term limited. Fourth, vacancies on the court are happening less frequently than ever in U.S. history, as Fisher in 22 finds that since 1970, the average length of tenure has almost doubled. As a result, Gold in 20 notes that justices confirmed multiple generations ago still sit on the bench, despite the current population not having any say over whether they should be there. Fortunately, term limits would remove justices at set intervals, replace temporary vacancies, and create reliable nominations of 2 judges per presidency, according to the most cited term limit proposal by Calaresi in 06. And this is critical to ensure that the court respects the origins of power. As he explains that the political process of nomination and confirmation serves as the most important democratic check on the court, as the people they approve and thereby influence the views of the court's members. Constitutional understandings change over time, and the selection of new judges is a principal means by which such changes find their way into our laws. It is the primary mechanism by which the Supreme Court is tied directly to the democratic process. My second contention is keeping with the times. Lifelong tenure pollutes the court that are far out of step with society's needs for 2 reasons. First, judges are staying on the court later and later into their lives. All in 16 finds that the age justices leave office has steadily increased into the 18th century, from 58 years to 78 years today. Second, Grabowski in 11 argues that while legal issues related to patent or bankruptcy develop slowly, technological innovation has been speeding up, and justices are getting further and further behind. The impact is undermining judicial decision-making. Grabowski continues that most Supreme Court justices lack a rudimentary understanding of current technology like phone tracking, crypto, or even texting. As a result, they are far more likely to make decisions that misapply the law due to a misunderstanding of the facts. The Supreme Court has said explicitly that it does not have a broad enough understanding of new tech to evaluate the constitutional issues that are arising around it, which will have profound implications for the First Amendment, media law, and communications policy. Thankfully, King in 21 finds that by regularly bringing fresh perspectives and knowledge, term limits would ensure the court will be more representative of American public's current viewpoints and knowledgeable of the issues they face. My third contention is overthrowing the critocracy. which is defined as rule by the judges as opposed to the rule by law. A tenured Supreme Court is inherently illegitimate as a matter of principle. Modern democratic theory holds that the will of the people is inherently self-limiting, meaning it would be illegitimate for us to completely give up our ability to self-govern, such as by electing a dictator. The public can only concede power conditionally. Therefore, it cannot be the case that we have given any member of the Supreme Court both the power to have the final say over our rights and the right to keep their position indefinitely. As a matter of principle, the two are mutually exclusive. Thus, Charles of Duke University in 13 explains that the decision to institute lifelong judicial review as a method of final decision-making is morally identical to electing a dictator. Both the decisions involve the transfer of power over inalienable rights in irreversible ways. Citizens cannot legitimately give up power to anyone indefinitely. Therefore, a tenured Supreme Court, like an elected despot, makes decisions on questions that the majority cannot legitimately relinquish power over. For these reasons, I urge an affirmative ballot, and I'm open for cross-examination.
All right, is everyone ready for cross-ex?
Yes,
Awesome. What is the origin of the U.S.'s power?
the people.
The people. So would it, for example, take over power from indigenous people?
What do you mean by it? Like the addition of people?
Right. So the origin of the U.S. power was stripping away power from indigenous peoples. Do you believe that's just?
Wait, I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
Right. So the origin of the U.S. power was taking away land, taking away power from other people. Should we respect them just
That's
because
not what
it's
I'm talking about. When I'm talking about the origins of power, I'm talking about a procedural respect for public representation and accountability. That's not what I'm talking about at all with the origins of power.
Okay, fine. Then let's talk about public representation. So is this always just?
I'd say that public representation should always be just. There may be a few scenarios where it always isn't just, but again, we're looking towards governmental legitimacy, and a legitimate government is one that follows the will of the people.
Okay, and so should we always rule how the majority wants?
No, then again, my framework isn't about majoritarianism. My framework is about representation and making sure that the viewpoints of the majority of Americans are heard. And
Yeah, but inherently that lends itself to the repression of the viewpoints of minority.
it doesn't.
correct?
Again, I'm not talking about majoritarianism. I'm talking about representation.
Okay, so what's the clear difference insofar we can only
So
represent
the
that
clear
one
difference, we
people?
can even see it through my framework. We're looking at representing what the majority of American citizens wants and need. The way we have representation in the Supreme Court is through the presidents we elect. However, when multiple generations of people are not having any say over the Supreme Court justices, that's illegitimate.
Okay, but let's look at it principle level. Where is the bright line as to where mob mentality is no longer just?
Again, mob mentality would never be just, but also we're not looking at what the majority of citizens want. Even though that is my third impact, we're still saying the majority of all groups of people want this. But not only that, we're making sure that all American citizens are represented. That's what my framework's looking at.
Okay, that's fine. Let's go on to the contention level analysis. So why does this have to happen in the judicial branch and not in the executive or legislative
Well, we're
branches?
debating about the judicial branch right now.
I mean, sure, but can't like the public hold the executive and legislative branches accountable? Why does it need all three branches?
I'd say the judicial branch is unique because it has specific obligations. Remember, right now we're debating about the
All right,
judicial branch.
What
It's
is the
not my
specific
obligation
obligation of the court?
to follow the Constitution and make decisions that set precedent. They have many
And
obligations.
it's supposed to do that as a final neutral arbiter of the law. Correct?
Can you restate what the question is?
Right, so the obligation of the court is to act as a final neutral arbiter of the law.
I'd say so, yes. They have some
Okay,
things they have to
So
do before
insofar
that.
the
but-
court is supposed to be neutral, how can it be beholden to public will?
I'm sorry, can you speak up
Right,
a
so
little
you
bit?
say the court is supposed to be neutral, but then you talk about how we need representation of people. So like, don't those two things conflict?
They don't at all. The court always is going to act constitutionally and neutral. And the way they do this is by representing the viewpoints of citizens.
Okay, even if the majority of citizens want something unjust, should we implement that?
No, again, we're talking about representation, not majoritarianism. The government still has to tell if something is going to be just and constitutional.
Okay, we're at time. Starting writing prep now. Is everyone ready? Awesome. With with that, I negate to resolve the justices of the Supreme Court of the United States ought to be term limited. I share the value of governmental legitimacy. However, my value criterion is upholding the rule of law. The U.S. courts define the rule of law as a principle under which all people and institutions are accountable to laws that are publicly known, equally enforced, independently adjudicated, and consistent with international human rights principles. Upholding the rule of law is the obligation of the court and thus best to evaluate the ground. Contention 1, violating precedent. Flag 17 explains that term limits will cause the court to shift rapidly as party control changes and allowing justices to create new policy and thus ignore the confines of precedent. This is for 2 key reasons. First, increasing judicial activism. Flag 17 furthers that life tenured justices know they have time to allow the law to gradually develop on its own. However, term-limited justices may feel the need to make more activist decisions during their finite time on the bench and thus use their limited time to enact new policy as quickly as they can. Second, increasing turnover. Jury 19 conducted an empirical analysis of an 18-year term limit, finding independently of political views that Roe v. Wade would have been overruled in 1987, reinstated in 2009, and then overruled again in 2017, simply due to different interpretations of the Constitution. Lindquist 17 corroborates, finding that state Supreme Courts with lifetime tenure overrule fewer precedent than state Supreme Courts with fixed term limits. Precedent plays a vital role in preserving democracy, as Schultz 23 reports that precedent is critical in safeguarding fundamental rights as it fosters consistency, efficiency, and predictability in the law. Without respect for precedent, Johnny Hughes 23 finds that decisions would be based on personal biases and preferences of justices rather than clear and consistent principles. Contention 2, docket manipulation. The White House in 2021 finds that term limits create incentive for gamesmanship in court cases in 3 key ways. First, litigants or lower court judges may time their cases to coincide with a swing justice's loss of power. Second, justices hear non-ideal cases or ones that have not fully made their way through lower courts to rush a decision. And third, justices vote to delay hearing the case until a colleague has left the court or re-argue it afterwards. Prior 16 corroborates. When a vacancy occurs before a case has been argued, the probability that the justices will choose to re-argue it increases from 1.3% to 4.6%. When a justice leaves the court after a case has already been argued, the probability increases from 1% to 15.6%. Moreover, Hellman 06 finds that term limits encourage justices to overlook issues relating to justiciability, like standing, mootness, and ripeness, to rush decisions before leaving the court. The consequences of this manipulation extend beyond docket management, affecting the quality of decisions, stalling the court's efficiency, and ultimately undermining the duty of justices to remain impartial. For these reasons, I negate, and I'll move on to address the affirmative, starting on that value criterion about respecting the origins of power. So 3 key reasons as to why you prefer the negative value criterion of rule of law. The first is because of accurate specificity. We're talking about the Supreme Court here, and the obligation of the court is to uphold the rule of law. It's to adjudicate impartially. It's not to represent the people specifically. That's the executive branches. That's the legislative branches. That's going to be really important as I move through my rebuttal. But then the second key reason as to why you prefer rule of law is to provide you no clear bright line. Sure, it's time and time again that representing the people isn't just representing the majority, but at that point in time, she provides no mechanism in which we could represent everyone. Inherently, the government has conflicts between rights and interests, and the way we adjudicate that is through the Constitution, which clearly enumerates the rights that we have to provide to minority interests. And the way that we ensure that's upheld is through the Supreme Court. It's through adjudicating impartially. And then finally, my third argument as to why you uphold the rule of law is just because the people want it doesn't automatically make it just. The majority of people supported slavery at the founding of America. I really struggle to call that just, though. When we focus on the rule of law, we make sure, for example, things are consistent with human rights principles. With that in mind, though, let's move on to the first contention. As an overview, 2 key points. First, as Bandwidth 05 explains, too much public influence would undermine the primary function of the judicial branch to protect basic rights against popular sentiment. Instead, public influence would lead to more ideological and less qualified justices. Justice 22 corroborates, finding the Constitution does not require justices to follow public opinion. It was specifically designed to insulate the justices from politics, from popular sentiment. But then the second part of this overview review comes from Claire 16, who conducted an empirical analysis and found that term limits make justices less democratically accountable by impacting the composition of the courts, issuing less progressive decisions, and ultimately causing more ideological gaps. Because of this, her impacts don't stand, because she's failed to show to you why the primary obligation of the court is to represent the people, because it simply isn't. But then let's move on to the specific warrant she presents to you on that first idea that it's random. Look to the second contention. I tell you in my case that the idea of this randomness as justices is really important in making sure the court is actually hearing cases and then deciding them impartially. But then you can turn this point, because in the world of the affirmative, things like the election of justices become much more politicized. That's F19, who explains to you that term limits guarantee the Supreme Court will be a campaign issue in every presidential election, because voters would know with certainty that the next president will get to shape the courts. The problem is that justices can't act impartially, and we're not truly seeing people represented, because as Fansburg 05 continues, interest groups would see larger expected returns from pressuring candidates to make promises about how they use their nominations. So we're not reflecting the people in her world, we're reflecting rich companies. But then on our second world, in which she talks about accountability, cross by what I just said, that's not the primary obligation of courts, and empirically we find the exact opposite. But then on our third argument about Americans' favor, again, classify what I say in the framework. Just because Americans favor it doesn't automatically make it just. The majority of Americans favor slavery, that doesn't make it just. On the fourth point about vacancies less frequent, the problem here is what I tell you in my second contention, that when we see a lot of justices serving for a long time, that ensures like we have things like impartial adjudication of the law. But then on our second contention, in which he talks about keeping with the times, remember what I already explained, that's not inherently just, that's not inherently the point of the court. But then in our argument that people are serving later, McGuire 5 runs the exact opposite, finding modern judges do not serve markedly different tenures than they did in the early years of the court. For example, in the early 1800s, they served 24 years. That's about how much they serve now. But then finally, you can turn this point, because it's not unique to the affirmative growth. That's Hellman 16 explained to you there's numerous other mechanisms to connect the public to the courts. For example, we can pack the courts, or we can strip it of its jurisdiction. But then this point about technology, again, we have other mechanisms solved. That's why things like briefings exist. That's why things like clerks exist. And then on our third contention, in which he talks about they shouldn't be ruled by the law, that is exactly the obligation of the justice. The justice is to interpret the law. It's not to reflect the public. That's the fatal flaw in my opponent's argument. And I'm ready for cross.
Is everybody ready for cross? I will begin now. So starting with the value of governmental legitimacy, what are some of the obligations of the government?
Yeah, so I'd say the obligations of the government is to uphold the rights of people, but specifically in this round, we're zeroing in on the judicial branch, whose obligation is to uphold the rule of law.
So you agree also, like making sure that people are represented is very important.
Well, I'm saying the obligation of the government is to uphold and provide dues to citizens, uphold the rights.
Does only one branch of the government have to represent people, or should all branches of the government represent people?
I would say the obligation of that is the executive and legislative branch. That's what the
So the
Constitution
judicial branch shouldn't look towards representing the people.
I'm saying the
Wouldn't that
judicial
lead to
branch.
pretty corrupt things?
Okay, I would say the obligation of the judicial branch is to interpret the Constitution. That is how it is outlined in the Constitution.
So it shouldn't
At
look
the
towards
end-
the interest of the people at all. It should just look towards the Constitution.
I would say insofar the interests of the people conflict with the Constitution and conflict with the rule of law.
Okay, so let's move on to the rule of law. So a Supreme Court decision is the last say on like a law, right?
Sure.
Okay, so how could they possibly make a decision that doesn't uphold the rule of law?
Yeah, so I'd say the idea is look at the 4 criteria I provide you, that like it's equal in force, independently adjudicated, consistent with
Right,
human rights.
so
principles,
every
and public-
decision they make is the last decision. That's the rule of law. So how can they make a decision that does not uphold the rule of law?
Yeah, so again, you're oversimplifying my value criteria. Look at the 4 criteria I give to you. So a really key element of that is it's independently adjudicated. If the court is not making decisions independently, then it's not upholding the rule of law.
Okay, so what other ways does the court make decisions that would not be independently? Like you agree the judicial branch is independent, right?
No, so I'd argue in a world with term limits, we undermine the independence of the judiciary branch. You
Okay, but
literally
in the
say that we
negative-
want to have
right.
public
In the
influence and
negative
not
world.
allow it to be independent.
And the negative world, right? You agree that the judicial branch is independent.
I would say that's where going correct.
Okay, so again, since they are independent, how do they have any checks, like you stated?
Yeah, so the checks is through that like appointment and confirmation process.
So just make, once they're on there, how do we have any checks once justice is actually making a
I
decision?
mean, that's the Hellman 16 card I read in response to your case. And number 1, we have impeachments, but other than that, like we can shrink the size of the court, we can pack it, we can strip it of just disability.
Okay,
like,
so if
can
we
ignore
shrink the size of the
commandments.
court, like all this has nothing to do with like term limits though. This is like other policies.
Yeah, that's exactly my point. That the advocacy you talk about is not unique to the affirmative role. If we want to put checks and balances on the court, we can do that through packing it or stripping of jurisdiction
Okay.
or like not
Let's
ignoring
move
its
on to your
mandates.
first contention about violating the precedent. So Supreme Court justices, you agree, like some of those like qualified individuals.
qualified, sure.
Okay, so now saying that like because of this, they just because you have like a term limit, like they have a set amount of years they rule for, why do you think they're just suddenly not going to follow precedent?
Well, because of the two different warrants I give you within case. So the first one is because we increased judicial activism. That's also a response I agreed against yours, that we increased the politicization of court. And then second, because of more turnover.
Okay, so now let's move on to this point about like an increasing turnover. So like what is like the current rate of turnover?
I don't have a specific number for you, but it happens obviously at a smaller frequency than me.
It's happening more frequent right now, right?
I would not say like under 18 years, like it's gonna have more turnover. If there's no more turnover, then none of the points you talk about matter.
Okay, that's fine. Can I see, please, the evidence about how Roe v. Wade would be overturned multiple times, please? And I'll start. In this speech, I will be going negative affirmative. Is everybody ready? Then I will begin. So starting with my opponent's value of governmental legitimacy, we agree to this, but we need to see who achieves this better. But that cannot be on the negative side because generations and generations of people will go by without being represented, and that's not a legitimate government. Now, moving on my opponent's criterion of upholding the rule of law. I have two main responses to this. First, the Supreme Court has the last say in what the law is, so they can't possibly make a decision that doesn't uphold the rule of law. That could lead to extremely illegitimate and unjust things. And further, my framework is a prerequisite to theirs. The government and the Constitution will have no power unless the will of the people actually consent to this. So we must have consent to the government before we can actually follow the rule of law. Now, moving on to my opponent's first contention about violating the precedent. My opponent starts off this contention saying how the court's going to like shift rapidly. We're going to see some polarization. But first, even if polarization sometimes occurs, it's barely a problem with term limits because the court composition will change faster. So we could get rid of these issues. And then secondly, on the other hand, when polarization happens on the negative, like with the current 6-3 split, that'll take years and years without having any representation before it goes away. And that's going to be a really big issue. Then moving down this contention, my opponent brings up how we're going to be increasing judicial action and says that this is going to be a bad thing. But I'd say term limits actually promote accountability while promoting judicial independence. According to Bandow in 15, judicial independence does not require lack of accountability. Fixed terms would establish judicial accountability. Justices would be independent, largely immune to political retaliation, but abusive judges would no longer serve for life. Further, the case of India proves lifelong tenure is irrelevant to independence. Black in 16 writes that judges in India, who have some of the shortest term limits in the world, are also some of the most independent in the world. Then down this contention, my opponent brings up this example of how Roe v. Wade would have been overturned multiple times. However, their evidence is about turnover, but it is flawed because they would have reviewed it. But their evidence states they would have reviewed it every single 2 years. But this is flawed because it says in their own evidence that they wouldn't review it every 2 years. That's just unrealistic. Now, moving down, the last thing my opponent brings up this contention is how these decisions were based on personal beliefs. But again, there's no reason to believe this would be worse on that. If the judge already makes a decision based on personal beliefs, it's going to happen on both sides. We can't get rid of that. Moving on to my opponent's second contention about document manipulation. In this contention, they mainly talk about how judges are going to hear cases more often and overlook issues. This is going to cause inefficiency. But again, this is non-unique. Remember, if a judge is going to act corruptly, that's not going to happen anything different by enacting term limits. Also, remember, let's look at the case of India. India has one of the most independent judiciaries despite having term limits. Now, moving back to the affirmative, starting off the framework, my opponent attacks my criterion by saying the obligation of the court is to follow the rule of law, not the judicial branch. So remember, all branches of the government have the obligation to look towards the people and respect their interests. Further, my opponent says that this has no right line, but we achieve respecting the origins of power when the people of America actually are represented by America. Further, my opponent says the majority of people isn't always just. But again, my framework's not majoritarianism. I'm looking at achieving representation because the power of our government comes from the consent of the people, not from the Constitution. Now, moving on to my first contention, my opponent gave like 2 overviews. First, they say too much public influence is going to cause pretty much bad things. But I'd argue that public influence would actually be a good thing because having public influence means that America's viewpoints are actually being heard. Then my opponent states that justices will be less accountable, but they really gave no warrant for this. Further, my opponent attacked my first and my third warrant, so I'm going to focus on my second and fourth. My second one is my lingering evidence that explains the only check on the court is impeachment, but that is politically impossible. This goes completely unresponded to, and it's going to be really important in today's round. My fourth one is from Fisher. My opponent, this is about how vacancies are less frequent. My opponent again responded to this with some evidence, but it was not responsive to what I'm actually arguing here. I'm arguing that justices from multiple generations ago are determining what rights we have right now, and that's wrong. On my second contention about keeping with the times, my opponent says they won't serve for longer, but all evidence proves that justices or the age justices leave the office are increasing. And then they said that it's not unique, but I'd say court packing would be bad. For those reasons and many more, I urge you to confirm.
All right, I had 145 subjects running, so I'll take that now. Order is going to be a framework on neg app keyboarders. Is that ready? Awesome. The crux of today's debate has come down to the idea about whether the court should be beholden to public interest or not. To that I say, why was the Constitution written with 3 distinct branches? The reason that we have the judicial branch is so that it is not beholden to public interest. It was specifically designed so that it would be insulated from politics, so that it would be insulated from popular sentiment. That's going to be really important as you consider today's round. So let's go on directly to the framework debate about the rule of law versus this idea of respecting origins of government. She tells you the rule of law doesn't make sense to the Supreme Court because everything would be just under that. But again, she ignores the example I give you in cross-examination. Look at the 4 criteria I provide you, specifically the one where it's like independently adjudicated and consistent with human rights. For example, if you look at a decision like Plessy v. Ferguson, that was not consistent with human rights. That's where the Supreme Court failed the rule of law. And if you look at something like independent adjudication, I showed you in my previous rebuttal how that has failed in the affirmative road. That's why we failed the rule of law. That's going to be really important because that's the only substantive response she gives to my framework. And insofar she fails to wear her value criteria of representing the people, her ideas of public influence don't matter under my framework. But then let's go on to the idea that like my opponent keeps reiterating the same argument that just because it's the majority doesn't mean it's actually representation. But Judge, for example, look to the election of a president. What we elect but based upon what the majority wants. At the end of the day, the upper government is always going to have conflicts of interest, conflicts of rights. At the core tenet, the government is going to weigh that based upon what's going to maximize it overall. The problem with that is that inherently lends itself to oppression of minority representation, of minority rights. What's the bright line there? It's things like the Constitution. It's the court that protects those rights. That's going to be really important that she's losing framework in today's round. But then let's move on to the first contention provided by the negative, this idea of violating precedent. She makes this response that it's a barely a problem because composition changes. That's going to be important because in that response, she concedes the second warrant I give to you that we're going to see more turnover. That's going to be important because turnover has a direct lead into violating precedent. But on the first warrant I give to you about judicial activism, she tells you that we have to balance independence and accountability. But judges, accountability is not the same thing as politicization. The card I give you specifically is that judges become more activists. They issue more political decisions. The problem with that, again, is they're failing their basic duty to interpret the Constitution impartially. Insofar, we're just doing what judges want politically. We're not actually serving the people. We're not actually fulfilling the governmental legitimacy. But then, let's move on to, then she gives on this example about India and how they have short-term limits. Because Kalantri 22 finds the Indian justices are super corrupt because they often offer pro-government decisions. But even at that, this analysis is applied because the Indian Supreme Court is usually made up of 2 judges. It's really different in America. But then on the second warrant I give to you, she tells you my study is flawed because it's reviewed every 2 years, but she doesn't like explain why it has any impact on the study. Even if you don't believe that though, you're going to provide the link to a 17 card I provide to you that goes unresponded. That's not speculative evidence. That is fact that we see state Supreme Courts with lifetime tenure, they overrule fewer precedents. But then let's move on to the second issue in which I talk about document manipulation. Judges, this is going to be the most important point in today's round because she fails to interact with this argument sufficiently. She just tells you it's non-unique, but look to the unique warranting I give you within case, where if we know when a swing justice is leaving, if we can mark the date in our calendars, that means those who agree with the swing justice are going to push forward decisions, and those who disagree are going to delay decisions. That's really important because it massively stalls court inefficiency. And insofar the court cannot actually decide anything, we never see any positive impacts of people being represented. People cannot be represented if all we're doing is arguing whether we should hear a case or not. That's going to be really important again because she drops this argument. But then let's move on on to the affirmative side of flow, starting on this first issue in which we talk about the power to people. Look at the couple of different cards I read that talk specifically with the Constitution, talk specifically about the obligation of government. Again, it's not public influence. These impacts still don't stand. But most importantly, is she insufficiently responds to the Claire 16 analysis it gives you that we actually see the judicial branch being less democratically accountable. She tells you I have more no warrant if I tell you it's because we're impacting the composition of the courts, less progressive decisions, and because we're causing ideological gaps. That's really important because she provides no empirical analysis of this actually occurring. I give you facts, she gives you rhetoric. But then on this idea that we're not actually checking people and that justice is ignored generations of people. However, she drops the politicization turn I give to you that tells you it's going to become more of a campaign issue. That's important because Fainsworth 05 explains you see massive influence of interest groups. In the affirmative world, we're not representing more people, we're representing more companies, we're representing more elites. We're not actually seeing any positive impacts of the people on this. But then on the second and third contentions in which she talks about keeping with the times, I've already explained to you why this is unique, and she doesn't even respond to the third contentions. So these 2 points aren't going to matter in today's debate. So with that in mind, let's move into my key running issues for today's round. The first one is going to be this issue of politicization / judicial activism. I tell you, number one, it's going to be a campaign issue. Let me remind you, dropped by my opponent. But then second of all, I tell you, we see increase of judicial activism because of a limited time. That's going to be really important, again, because we're not reflecting the people, we're reflecting interest groups. But my second key voting issue is this idea of public influence. Let me remind you, as I told you time and time again in struggle, it's not the duty of the court to represent the people. That's the executive branch, that's the legislative branch, and they check on that. The protection of minority interests is the judicial branch. But let's just look at the worlds we create today. The worlds we create today is when we have no separation of power between the Supreme Court and between the legislative branch. It's one that rules by majority. It rules by whatever the people want. It doesn't rule by principles of justice. But then my third and most important key voting issue of today's round is the idea of document manipulation. Let me remind you, my opponent never sufficiently interacts with that. Because of that, we see massive delays and massive rushing of cases, which means we see massive court inefficiency. That's going to be important because it wipes out the entire affirmative offense. Insofar cases aren't being decided, we see no representation of people. All we see is these justices bickering between one another. We see this assault grader with lifetime tenure. That's why I urge a negative ballot.
In the speech, I will be going over framework and key voting issues. Is everybody ready? My opponent doesn't achieve governmental legitimacy and therefore cannot win the round because she agreed to my definition from Aspermount that the will of the people constitutes the ultimate source of governmental legitimacy. So if the government is not following the will of the people and what the people want, therefore we cannot achieve governmental legitimacy, and my opponent agrees that throughout today's round. Remember, a government will be illegitimate if generations and generations of people go by without being represented. My first key voting issue is that of judicial independence and action. This is really important to achieving governmental legitimacy so the voices of the public are actually being heard. Remember my Bandow evidence that proves that term limits promote accountability and independence, and we see other good effects from this. Remember, throughout this round, my opponent makes this big deal about how the judicial branch doesn't have to look towards the public interest. But let's look at the opposite of that. If the judicial branch made decisions that didn't look towards the public and actually helping the public, that would be inherently unjust and really wrong. So obviously, the Supreme Court has to look towards actually what the public needs and wants and what changes to the Constitution should be made that will actually help the public. My second key voting issue is keeping with the times. According to all, the age justices leave office has steadily increased. The only responsive thing my opponent said to this is that they aren't going to serve for longer, but this evidence proved that justices are staying longer. Remember my Grabowski evidence that tech innovation is speeding up and justices are getting further and further behind. The Supreme Court justices explicitly said themselves that they don't have a broad enough understanding to make major decisions on constitutional issues. This has huge implications for all of our rights. For the First Amendment, media law, and communications policy. This is really important and didn't get talked about much in today's round. But however, term limits solve. This is my evidence from King. Term limits solve because they bring fresh perspectives that ensure the court is more representative of America's current viewpoints. My third and final key voting issue is power of the people. So my opponent said I dropped a lot of points, but remember, I'm just focusing on my second and fourth warrants. Remember my Langren evidence about impeachment, which again went unresponded to. Langren explains that the only check on the court is impeachment, which is politically impossible because half of the Senate will never vote to convict a justice of their own party. This means that the judicial branch isn't being accountable for their actions, and the people's public aren't actually being represented. However, remember my Calabresi evidence that term limits would solve because they remove justices at set intervals, replace temporary vacancies, and create regular vacancies. Remember that constitutional understandings change throughout time, and the selection of new judges is the principal means by which such changes find our way into our laws. So judges, today's round, I urge you to look into my criteria respecting the origins of power for two reasons. First, the government's authority comes from the people's consent to the Constitution, not the Constitution itself. So therefore, when we're looking at the Constitution, again, and the Supreme Court is making decisions about this, they have to be making decisions that actually help the people. If they made a decision that didn't help the people, that would be wrong and illegitimate. And secondly, no public official has a legitimate claim to absolute authority. And we see that currently in the status quo, and that is illegitimate and wrong. So in today's round, I urge you to vote aye.